Hello, this is Ed Fortunato, and I'm going to give you the presentation on the baseball game. Next slide, please. So the assignment was to fly a 200 nautical mile VFR flight to a baseball game. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I fly out of Manassas, so I picked the Tri-City area, and they've got the Dust Devils. So this is the team we're going to go see and the flight we're going to take. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through the pre-flight planning, the route, the weather, and all the other considerations that you take into doing a general aviation trip like this. So the first thing you do is you look at yourself. So these are my credentials. So I'm a fixed wing pilot, commercial rated in instruments, and then also rotary wing, commercial and instruments. Single engine qualified, obviously learning multi-engine, about 240 hours. Because I live within the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area, you have to be qualified, which I am, and then go through all the different requirements for just assessing yourself, both your health, any medication you may be on, stress, external factors, things like that. So again, I look at this, I feel comfortable with the flight. It's a general aviation flight. There's no reason to do this if I don't feel comfortable, and we plan accordingly. My passenger is my wife. So we're just going to go out and look at this. She is not an aviator. In fact, she doesn't know how to do any of the flight of the aircraft, but she's flown with me a couple of times. So she understands the airplane, she understands what it's like to fly general aviation, and so far she trusts my abilities. We'll go through the flight summary, but the premise is you do as much detailed planning as you can on the ground. You'd rather do all that on the ground, look at the route, look at the weather, assess everything, and have a really good plan. Even though you're using a lot of automation, I still like to rely on a lot of pencil work just to make sure that as a backup I can do what I need to do. And then again, single pilot, single resource management. Make sure you understand the airplane yourself. And I do use my wife as an assistant. I mean, she is there. She's capable to listen to the radio calls. I'll have her write things down, and she can serve as a backup, which does come in handy. Next slide. So this is the aircraft we're going to fly, a Diamond 42. So twin engine. I've gone through the logbook. I've looked at all the ADs. I've looked at the equipment list, and it's good for IFR flight. It's good for VFR flight. There are no squawks on it, so I've got a healthy airplane. And then this is the performance data, and we'll get into the weight and balance and CG, but basically I've got 235 horsepower engines. Best cruise is around 156 knots, 156, 160 usually works pretty good. Burning about 12.5 gallons per hour in cruise, a little bit more obviously on a climb, and you factor that into the planning. I've got my burn rate, I've got my stall. Basically I need about 1,500 feet for takeoff and landing to have any sort of no sort of issues. And then I also look at the systems on the airplane. Personally, I like flying a G1000 cockpit. I could fly other Garmin aircraft, but with the frequency I fly, which is about once every week or two, I like as much consistency as I can, and that's the aircraft that the cockpit that I'm comfortable with. And everything else is good. It does have de-ice. This time of year, I don't think we'll need it, but it's good to have, and it's good to understand the systems that you have on the airplane. Next slide. So this is the performance planning. And interestingly, one of the characteristics of Diamonds is if you fill them up with fuel, and this one has the extended range tanks, you max yourself out very quickly. So actually, by having just 10 pounds of gear in the front and 25 pounds in the back, so I figured we'd bring some bags in case you have to remain overnight. Again, this is general aviation. It maxed me out with full fuel. So I had to defuel from 50 gallons down to 40, and my reserve tank, I went from 26 down to 10. So that put me right at the edge of the max gross weight, but definitely within the center of gravity differences. So my total gross weight is 3746. I think I could go up to 3755 or something like that. And then my calculated center of gravity is 95.14, which is sufficiently between 94 and 98. So I'm within CG limits for both takeoff and landing, and I've got a good weight and balance. Next slide. This is the flight we're going to take. It's basically a southwesterly flight, straight line distance. It was actually pretty easy to plan. What's nice about the route is the 269 nautical miles, so a little bit further than I need to. I've got a lot of airports all along the route, and halfway, at the halfway mark, a little bit beyond, is Roanoke. So I've got a Class C airport right there if I need to fly into. A little bit of mountains, but basically the highest terrain feature that I have is 4,000 MSL, 4,000 feet MSL. I'm going to fly it at about 8,500 MSL, and it gives me a lot of options coming down. Although this is a VFR flight, I like to always have alternates. You just don't know what weather's going to do. That's one of the biggest concerns that I've always got when I'm flying. So I always plan alternates. I like to plan one to the north and one to the south. So as I come in, I can deviate to either one. They've got instrument approaches. They've got runways that are sufficiently long for me to land in this airplane. And I've got a lot of decision points along the route, whether to determine whether I continue or whether I turn around. And that begins before even takeoff. So I've got a very detailed flight. I've got tick marks, and I've got fuel for the mission, and it's a pretty straightforward flight. Next. So then we look at the environment. I already talked about this. Flying at about 156 knots, it's going to take me about an hour and 45 minutes of flight time. I've got plenty of fuel for the mission. I talked about the altitude before, 8,500 feet, maybe 6,500. I would prefer to have a little bit of extra altitude. All the airports, I've got, like I said, I need about 1,500 feet of runway. Even my alternates, my primaries and my alternates have runways that are long enough. My performance planning is good for takeoff. I'll show you weather in a minute, but I've got good weather going both directions. These are my alternates. Virginia Highlands, like I said, about a 4,500 foot runway, and an Elizabethtown Municipal 5,000 foot runway. I talked about my fuel already. Some of the things you need to consider in flying VFR is I kind of like to use flight following with air traffic control. So that just gives me a little bit more, let's call it positive control and assistance with ATC as you're flying along. But you also have to realize as you're planning this, you might have some delays in taking off or getting your clearances. I talked about the decision points, and then about 30 miles out from the tri-state area, you're going to call 8-ish, you're going to get the weather, you're going to make sure that it's a good opportunity to land. And then we talked about the single pilot resource management, G1000. I've got the autopilot. I'm able to offload as much as I can, utilize GPS and the other systems on the aircraft to allow me to fly and monitor the system as opposed to doing a stick and rudder flight the entire way, which I could do if I needed to. Pre-flight briefing, I always do that with my passenger, and it's also good for yourself, even if you're not. You go through all the 5 Ps, the route of flight, and all the other requirements to include the emergencies and procedures that you would need to do if you need to deviate. Next slide. So here's a snapshot of the weather. I've got the prog charts and the surface analysis. I've got the METAR, which shows, I've got scattered at 5,000 feet, 10 section miles of visibility, so everything's looking good there. On the terminal air dome forecast, same thing. I've got very light winds, great visibility, few clouds at 25,000 feet. So you can see the route of flight for me is right in this area here. We're in a high pressure system. You can look at the charts down here. I don't have any sort of significant activity or convective issues to concern with. So my forecast all the way through is good, and that'll get us to the baseball game. Next slide. So in summary, these are the considerations that I would take in planning this flight. Look at yourself, look at the aircraft, passenger expectations. This is general aviation. We may do it, we may not do it. I'll make that decision, and there will be no drama in anything that we're going to do. We do a good, thorough pre-flight, and I always brief my passenger on what we're doing so they can kind of get an idea of the route. We talked about the single pilot resource management and aviation decision making throughout. Fuel management is really important, making sure that you've got a good distribution out of both aircraft, both wings. And like I said, I had to start out by defueling the airplane and making sure it wasn't completely filled. So make sure I'm within CG and weight and balance, and then use the systems in the aircraft to ensure that we've got it's something that I feel comfortable managing. So that's how we're going to get to the Tri-City Airport and see the baseball game. Thank you.